Before I begin my story, I want to ask you something important. Do you have any family members who lived through, served in, or witnessed the horrors of World War II? If so, please leave a comment and also write which city you are watching from. I want to know how far that memory is traveling today. I am Margaret Elwood. I am 65 years old, born and raised in the English countryside. And I grew up hearing fragments of the life of a man who shaped our family in a quiet, firm, and profoundly human way. Today, for the first time, I am revealing what he left for us. I grew up believing that some people carried an invisible weight, something so deeply rooted in their past that words could never fully express it. My grandfather, Arthur Elwood, was one of those men. Even before I understood what the Second World War meant, I sensed that Arthur was shaped by something too large to fit into the conversations we had around the dinner table. I was still a child when I began noticing the way he paused at certain sounds, how he hesitated before answering simple questions, and how his gaze drifted not to the horizon itself, but somewhere far beyond it. My name is Margaret Elwood, and at 65 years old, I finally understand that the silence he carried was not a refusal to speak. It was a form of protection. It wrapped around our home like a second set of walls, shielding me from memories he believed no one should inherit. He raised me in a modest brick house on the outskirts of Staffordshire, a place where the wind moved through the fields in long sighs, and where the streets were lined with neighbours who seemed to know everyone's past except his. Arthur worked as a shoemaker in the village, a profession he claimed helped him put things back together. When I was little, I imagined he meant shoes. But as I grew older, I recognized he meant something else entirely. The war had torn apart the lives of countless families across the United Kingdom, and Arthur carried the knowledge of that with him every day. Like an invisible ledger he kept tucked beneath the calm surface of his voice. He never raised that voice, not once. Not when the shop lost customers, not when storms damaged the roof, not when I stumbled through my rebellious teenage years. His calmness irritated me at times. I wanted big stories, strong reactions, dramatic warnings delivered with the authority of a man who had seen history unfold in front of him. Instead, he answered my questions with a single phrase he repeated throughout my childhood. Understanding comes when the heart is ready. Maggie, I did not realize at the time how many meanings were hidden inside that sentence. Back then, the only thing I knew for certain was that Arthur had served during the Second World War. Adults whispered it with a strange mixture of admiration and sorrow. He never denied it, but he never confirmed the details either. When I asked him directly, bold and impatient as only a child can be, he would smile gently and ask whether I had finished my homework or fed our stubborn old cat, Pepper. I remember one autumn evening when I was about 9 years old. The sky was darkening early, the way it always does in the Midlands as winter approaches. Arthur sat in his armchair, polishing a pair of leather boots with slow, thoughtful strokes. I had been reading a school book about the war, filled with photographs of soldiers, air raid shelters, and ration books. I closed the book and asked him whether he had ever been afraid during those years. He paused, but only for a moment. "Fear," he murmured, "is something you learn to carry, like your own name." He never looked up from the boots he was polishing. Yet the way his fingers tightened around the cloth told me I had touched a part of him he kept hidden. That was the closest he ever came to describing what he had lived through. As I grew older, especially in the turbulent decades that shaped the generation I belonged to, I often wondered why he chose silence instead of explanation. I was a young woman during a period in the United Kingdom when voices were becoming louder: protests, reforms, shifting roles for women. Everything felt like it was pushing toward openness, but Arthur remained steady, unmoved. In my 20s, when I was working in Birmingham and beginning to build a life that felt independent, I sometimes questioned whether his quiet nature had been a burden or a blessing. Unlike many of my peers who spoke about parents or grandparents filled with dramatic wartime stories, I carried only fragments: a uniform tucked into a drawer, a medal he never displayed, a faded photograph of a group of men standing in mud, their faces hardened by realities I could not imagine. Arthur never explained the photograph, yet his eyes softened whenever he touched it, as though remembering the warmth of voices now silenced by time. By the time he grew older and his health began to fade, I sensed that unspoken truths lingered between us like unmailed letters. Some people leave behind diaries or long confessions, but Arthur left something more subtle, a quiet expectation that one day I would discover what he could not bring himself to say. His death in 1999 felt like a door closing before I had the chance to knock. Amid the grief and the exhaustion of funeral arrangements, I found the small wooden box he had left for me, my name carved into the lid by his own careful hands. I was not ready to open it then. Perhaps part of me feared that whatever waited inside would change the man I knew, reshaping him into someone defined not by the life he lived with me, but by the years that came before. So I placed the box on a shelf and allowed time to settle around it. The years stretched into decades, and life carried me forward: marriage, work, responsibilities, the quiet transformation into the older woman I am today. Yet the box remained untouched, its silence as steady as the man who created it. Only now, at 65, do I finally feel the weight of his words. Understanding comes when the heart is ready, and perhaps my heart, after all these years, is finally prepared to hear the truth that silence kept safe for so long. Looking back at my childhood and the quiet rhythm of life in Staffordshire, it is almost difficult to reconcile those early years with the decades that followed. I was born in 1960, at a time when Britain was still recovering from the long shadow cast by the war that had shaped my grandfather's adulthood. As a woman of the boomer generation, I grew up between two worlds: the past that Arthur rarely spoke of, and the rapidly changing society that demanded we question everything. Even in my earliest memories, I felt the tug-of-war between old expectations and new possibilities. The United Kingdom was undergoing a transformation, industry shifting, social roles evolving, and voices rising in ways they never had before. Yet, inside our small red brick house, time moved differently. Arthur believed in routines, steadiness, and living with dignity through small actions. I remember the smell of leather from his workshop drifting through the house, mixing with the morning tea he brewed with almost ceremonial care. As a girl, I didn't think much about the contrast between his quiet ways and the world outside. School introduced me to teachers who spoke of ambition, independence, and questioning the boundaries that had confined earlier generations of women. But Arthur simply encouraged me to listen to the world, to myself, and even to silence when it had something to teach. Whenever I rushed through the door with excitement over new ideas I'd learned, he would smile with a calm that felt almost unshakable. "Growth takes time, Maggie," he would say. "Give yourself room to understand what matters." My teenage years were filled with the turbulence many young people experience, though perhaps intensified by the era. The 1970s were marked by shifting cultural tides, political uncertainty, and new expectations of what women could become. I felt pressure to be outspoken, determined, and bold. Many of my friends argued loudly about rights, identities, and futures. I admired them, but inside me lived a quieter impulsive trait I inherited from Arthur. Even if I didn't want to admit it back then, sometimes I resented his measured nature. I longed for a dramatic family history I could reference. Stories that fit the larger-than-life narratives I heard from classmates whose relatives had served overseas. Whenever I asked Arthur for details about his wartime years, he would gently change the subject. It frustrated me, especially during a period when everyone seemed hungry for truth and transparency. I thought his silence meant he didn't trust me, or worse, that his past was too ordinary to matter. But as the years passed and I stepped into adulthood, I began to understand that the world Arthur returned to after the war was vastly different from the one emerging around me. His life had been defined by scarcity, rationed books, and loss, while mine was defined by opportunity, education, and the growing belief that women could build futures independent of expectations. In my early 20s, I moved to Birmingham, eager to prove my independence. The shift from village life to the busy streets of a growing city was overwhelming at first. I found work at a community office supporting local programs for families and young adults. I saw firsthand how the post-war generation had shaped the communities around me there. Resilience woven into the foundations of every neighborhood. People of Arthur's generation rarely spoke openly about their memories, yet their influence was visible everywhere. Despite my excitement over starting a new chapter, I returned home often. Part of me still needed the calm he offered, the grounding presence of the man who raised me. Every visit brought the same quiet warmth, the kettle whistling, the steady hum of his sewing machine, and his soft questions about my work and well-being. He never pried, never judged. He simply listened, allowing me to grow into myself without pressure. But even then, I sensed that there was more. He wanted to say something he held back, not out of shame, but out of belief that timing mattered. I remember one particular evening, just a few years before his health began to decline. We sat on the back porch, watching the fading light settle over the fields. The air was cool, carrying the earthy scent of the evening. He sipped his tea and asked whether I felt at home in the life I was building. I told him that I did, but that I sometimes feared disappointing him. Arthur set his cup down and looked at me with an expression I had rarely seen, one that held both pride and a hint of sorrow. "You don't owe me a version of yourself," he said. "You only owe yourself the chance to live without fear." I didn't understand at the time why his voice trembled slightly as he said those words. I thought he was simply being sentimental. Only years later would I realize that he was speaking from the depths of an experience he never allowed himself to fully share. My role as a boomer woman became clearer as I aged. I was part of a generation encouraged to move forward, but raised by people who had survived by holding tight to what they loved. This duality shaped me in ways I couldn't articulate then. I carried ambition, but also caution, independence, but also loyalty, strength, but also an understanding that silence can hold both harm and healing. Now, decades later, I see that Arthur's silence was not a barrier. It was a bridge. It connected the past he endured with the future he wanted me to claim. And though I didn't yet know the truth waiting inside the wooden box he left for me, I sensed that everything I had lived, the confusion, the admiration, the questions, was preparing me for the moment when that silence would finally break. For years, the wooden box sat untouched on the highest shelf of my wardrobe, its presence so constant that it became part of the landscape of my life. I dusted around it during spring cleanings, moved it carefully whenever I reorganized my belongings, and occasionally paused to stare at the carved letters spelling my name. Yet I never allowed myself to lift the lid. It felt as though opening it required a version of myself I had not yet become. The box was modest in its appearance, simple, dark wood, worn smooth at the edges from years of handling. Arthur had carved my name, Margaret, using the same steady hands that once repaired shoes for the people of our village. I remembered watching him work as a child, fascinated by the precision of each movement. His fingers, though thickened by labor, had an almost graceful certainty when they shaped leather or wood. When he engraved my name onto the box, he did so as if marking something sacred. I was 39 when he passed away. At that time, the grief felt heavy enough to push me into silence. I had no room for mysteries or revelations. The day after his funeral, when I discovered the box on his bedside table, along with a small note that simply read, "For Maggie, when the moment is right," my heart tightened. The idea of discovering some hidden truth frightened me. I feared it might change the man I thought I knew better than anyone. So I tucked the box away, telling myself that one day I would face it with calmness and clarity. But days became months, months slipped into years, and the box remained sealed. Even as I grew older, built my career, and watched the world evolve around me, a part of me remained the young woman who hesitated to touch the past. As I approached my 50s, I began thinking more deeply about the fragments of Arthur's life that had gone unanswered. I wondered about the years he spent away from home during the war. I wondered about the men he fought beside, the places he traveled, the memories he never allowed himself to express. Each question felt like a thin crack beneath the surface of the silence that had defined him. But still, I didn't open the box. There were moments during those years when I almost convinced myself to do it. Once, during a winter storm, the lights flickered and the house grew cold. I climbed onto a chair to fetch extra blankets, and there it was, the box staring down at me like a quiet invitation. I reached for it, held it in my hands for a long moment, and felt the cool grain of the wood beneath my fingers. But then a wave of hesitation washed over me, and I placed it back on the shelf. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment, but in truth, I was waiting for the courage to accept that the person I loved most in this world had lived through something too heavy to share. I feared seeing a version of Arthur marked by despair rather than the gentle resilience I had grown up with. When I turned 60, a shift began within me. Something about crossing that milestone made me reflective, more aware of how quickly life can pass. I started revisiting memories I'd tucked away, the night we spent listening to the radio, the quiet afternoons in his workshop, the stories he almost told but never quite finished. I thought about the sacrifices that generations before mine had made, and I felt an unexpected longing to understand the man who had shaped my early years. Still, the box remained closed. It wasn't until a morning, 2 months after my 65th birthday, that everything changed. I was sorting through old photo albums, preparing to donate unused items to a local charity. The sun filtered through the curtains in a soft golden hue, warm enough to make the dust particles glitter in the air. I opened a drawer, searching for a misplaced album, and found instead a photograph I had never seen before. It was a picture of Arthur standing beside 3 other men, all of them wearing uniforms. Their expressions were somber, but there was a closeness between them that spoke of shared trials and unspoken bonds. Arthur's eyes, so familiar yet strangely distant in the photograph, seemed to look at me through time. I felt the weight of the moment settle in my chest with a quiet certainty. I knew I could not keep running from the truth he had taken such care to preserve. The silence that had hovered over our family for decades was no longer something to fear. It was something to understand. With a steady breath, I climbed the small ladder to the wardrobe shelf. My hands trembled, slightly gnawed with fear, but with the realization that the moment Arthur had written about had finally arrived. I reached for the box, and this time I did not hesitate. The wood felt warmer than I remembered, almost as though it had absorbed the years of unspoken questions and waited patiently for this exact day. I held it close for a moment, thinking of the man who had raised me with quiet strength, and then walked to the living room where the morning light pooled like a soft invitation across the floor. I sat down, placed the box on my lap, and rested my hand on the carved letters. I whispered, almost involuntarily, "I'm ready now." The simple act of lifting the lid would change everything I thought I knew, not only about Arthur, but about the life he tried so carefully to build for me. The box, after waiting so long, was finally about to speak. The morning I finally opened the box felt strangely ordinary at first, the kind of day that arrives without warning and later marks a turning point in a life. The sky over Birmingham hung low with a soft grey tone, the kind that carried neither threat nor promise, only stillness. I remember thinking it was the perfect weather for staying indoors, sorting through memories, and perhaps confronting what I had avoided for decades. I did not wake up with a plan, but something inside me seemed to know what needed to happen. After making a simple breakfast and brewing tea the way Arthur used, too strong, with a hint of milk, I sat at the dining table and let the quiet fill the room. All around me were reminders of the life I had built. Framed photographs, well-worn books, and a few trinkets collected over the years. Yet none of it felt as heavy as the small wooden box resting beside me. I placed my fingertips on the lid, feeling the grooves of the carved letters of my name. My heart beat faster than it had in years, not out of fear but out of a deep sense of inevitability. I had waited long enough. Arthur had trusted me with something he believed could only be understood when the right moment arrived. And now, with age whispering its steady reminders, I knew I could no longer ignore what he had preserved. When I opened the box, the hinges made a faint sound, as though waking from a long sleep. Inside, there was no collection of trinkets, no medals, no photographs. There was only a single envelope, yellowed with time, edges slightly curled. The paper felt delicate, almost fragile. My name was written on it in the same tidy handwriting I had seen on birthday cards and notes he used too. Leave on the kitchen counter. Seeing it again after all these years made my breath catch in my throat. I lifted the envelope carefully, holding it as though it were a piece of glass. The weight of it was light, almost insubstantial, yet I could feel a heaviness beneath its surface, heaviness that had lived inside Arthur long before I was born. For a moment, I simply stared at the envelope, hesitant to tear the seal. Memories of my childhood rushed through my mind. Arthur polishing shoes in the workshop. Arthur listening to the radio in the evenings, his expression calm but distant. Arthur pausing at certain sounds that meant nothing to me but stirred something deep within him. I had always known he carried experiences larger than his words. What I hadn't known was that he believed I would one day be the one to carry them next. I opened the envelope with slow, careful movements. Inside was a folded letter written in ink that had faded into a soft blue. I unfolded it, expecting a few paragraphs or a brief message. Instead, I found page after page, written with the precision of someone who had rehearsed every sentence in his mind for years before letting it spill onto paper. The letter began with a simple sentence that struck me with unexpected force. Maggie, if you are reading this, it means you have lived enough to understand the value of truth. My hands trembled slightly as I continued reading. Arthur wrote about his time during the war, but not with the dramatic descriptions I had imagined as a child. There were no detailed accounts of battles, no grand stories of heroism. Instead, he wrote about people, about the young men he trained with, about the families left behind, and about the quiet fear that lived inside every soldier, no matter how brave they appeared on the outside. He spoke of one man in particular, a close friend named Edwin Rowley. Arthur described him as someone who carried laughter into even the darkest moments. Someone who believed that kindness could survive even in places where hope felt scarce. They had served in the same unit, facing the same nights of uncertainty and the same days that stretched on without answers. Arthur wrote about the night that changed everything. A night near the end of the war when their group was caught in a sudden attack. Edwin was badly injured, and Arthur stayed with him, promising he would not leave him alone. Edwin, aware his life was slipping away, asked Arthur to promise something to take care of the family he would never have the chance to create. Arthur had agreed, believing it was simply an act of compassion in a moment of despair. But Edwin's final request went deeper than that. He had told Arthur that if he survived, he needed to find purpose beyond the uniform to build a life that honored those who never made it home. And he asked Arthur to be the protector of anyone he came to love, as though his own presence could continue through those acts. Reading those words, I felt a tightening in my chest. I understood suddenly why Arthur had been the way he was, steady, quiet, deliberate in every gesture. His silence had not been emptiness. It had been a form of respect, a tribute to a friend whose voice had been silenced too soon. But the letter did not end there. Arthur wrote about returning home, about trying to adjust to a world that no longer resembled the one he had left. He wrote about meeting me as a small child and realizing he could offer the kind of protection and stability he had promised. He wrote about choosing to raise me not out of obligation, but out of deep, genuine love. As I read the final lines, my vision blurred slightly with emotion. Maggie, I could not give you a world free of pain, but I tried to give you one filled with safety. If you are reading this, know that my life found meaning through you. And now the truth I carried becomes yours to hold, not as a burden, but as a reminder of the strength that comes from compassion. I folded the letter slowly, letting each word settle into my heart. In that moment, the room felt different, lighter somehow, as though the silence that had once surrounded Arthur finally had the chance to breathe. I placed the letter back into the box, but I no longer saw it as an object of fear or uncertainty. It had become a bridge connecting the life Arthur lived with the life he had given me. That day, everything shifted, and nothing would be the same again. I woke with the uneasy awareness that the farm had grown quieter than usual. Even the wind felt distant, brushing softly across the fields as if it were trying not to disturb something hidden beneath the surface. The discovery I made the previous night had followed me into my dreams, haunting every corner of my thoughts. I kept replaying the moment I held that small metal object in my hands, its weight far heavier than its size should allow. It wasn't just an artifact, it was a message from my father, sealed decades ago, waiting for me to be ready. When I stepped out into the morning light, I noticed how the barn doors stood slightly ajar. I was certain I had locked them before going to bed. The latch was lifted, not broken or forced, but simply resting as though someone had opened it with deliberate calm. I pushed the door open and let my eyes adjust to the dim interior. Everything appeared in its usual place, yet the air felt disturbed, like someone had stood there just moments before I entered. I walked toward the far corner where the old storage trunk sat. It was the same trunk where I had found the hidden compartment. The lid was still closed, but the dust around it showed faint marks, as if someone had touched the floor with careful steps. I knelt and examined it more closely. The prints weren't sharp enough to identify, but they were recent. For a moment I held my breath, listening for any sound, any presence, any clue that I wasn't alone. Nothing answered. I opened the trunk and inspected the secret compartment again. Everything I had taken out the night before was still with me, locked in my bedroom drawer. That meant whoever entered the barn wasn't looking for the item itself. They must have been searching for confirmation that someone had already found it. A realization settled over me. The mystery my father left behind wasn't known only to me. Someone else had been watching, waiting, or perhaps searching for the same truth. I left the barn and walked toward the field behind the house. The tall grass swayed with the breeze, bending in patterns that reminded me of pathways. My father often brought me here when I was young, telling me stories of his childhood. He rarely spoke about his years of service, always redirecting the conversation to simpler memories. Now, as I crossed the field, I wondered how much of his silence had been protection rather than reluctance. I reached the old windmill, no longer functioning but still standing as one of the oldest structures on our land. For years it had been just a familiar landmark, a silhouette against the sky. Today it felt different. I circled it slowly, studying the wooden exterior. The boards near the base were darker than usual, not due to age, but moisture. I pressed my hand against the wood and noticed it shifted slightly. Something had been tampered with. Pulling gently, I managed to pry the loose board away. Behind it, hidden in the narrow hollow, was a folded piece of paper. My chest tightened as I reached for it. The edges were brittle, but the ink was still legible. It wasn't in my father's handwriting. It was a note dated several decades earlier, signed only with an initial Besset. The message wasn't long, yet its meaning struck me with quiet force. It referenced a promise, a location, and the words "safe until needed." The note didn't explain what needed protection, nor did it mention my father directly, yet something about the phrasing matched the tone he used when speaking about responsibility. I folded the paper carefully and placed it in my pocket. A hidden note behind a windmill wasn't something that happened by coincidence. Someone wanted it preserved, and someone else, perhaps the same person who visited the barn, might be trying to uncover it now. When I returned to the farmhouse, I paused at the front steps and looked back at the fields. The view had always comforted me, but today it seemed like an endless stretch of secrets waiting beneath the soil. I sat on the porch and let the afternoon sun warm my hands. My father had carried these burdens alone for so long. Now they were mine to face whether I felt prepared or not. As the light shifted toward evening, I realized the next step wasn't to hide what I knew, but to understand it. Whatever my father had been protecting, it connected the farm, the past, and the people who still lingered around us. I stood, took a deep breath, and walked inside, determined to keep following the trail he left behind. The evening settled over the farm with a stillness that felt almost deliberate, as if the land itself was waiting for me to make sense of everything I had uncovered. After finding the note in the windmill, I couldn't quiet my mind. I spent most of the night sitting at my desk, the folded paper resting under a lamp, its faded ink illuminated in a pale glow. Every sentence, every unfinished implication seemed to hint at more than I could yet understand. Whoever wrote it trusted that someone would find it when the time was right. Whether they intended that person to be me, I still didn't know. Sleep eventually came, but lightly, and by dawn I was awake again. The early light spread across the horizon, brushing the fields with muted gold. I stepped outside and breathed the crisp air, hoping it would steady the restless thoughts circling inside me. I felt an unexpected pull toward the old storage shed near the tree line. It had always been part of the property, used mainly for tools and seasonal supplies. But suddenly it seemed like a place my father might have used for more than I realized. As I approached, I noticed a detail I had never paid attention to before, a narrow gap beneath the door where the dirt was disturbed, as if someone had recently walked in or out. I pushed the door open slowly. The shed smelled of wood, earth, and time. Dust floated in the thin rays of sunlight that cut through the cracks in the roof. Nothing looked out of place at first glance, but my instincts urged me deeper inside. I knelt beside the back wall, where a stack of wooden crates sat neatly arranged. I moved them one by one, revealing a small square panel carved into the wall. Its edges were faint, almost invisible unless you were specifically looking for them. My heartbeat quickened. I lifted the panel carefully, revealing a hollow compartment. Inside was a metal box, smaller than a book, with a latch that opened smoothly when I touched it. Inside the box was a bundle of rolled papers tied with twine. They were old, but well preserved, as if someone had stored them here intentionally to protect them. I untied the twine and unrolled the first sheet. It contained a simple hand-drawn map of the farm, but not as it currently looked. Structures were missing, others were added, and certain areas were circled. The largest circle lay deep in the woods behind the property, an area I rarely visited because of its dense vegetation. The second sheet contained short written notes. They spoke of safekeeping, transition, and something referred to only as the inheritance, though it didn't seem connected to money or property. Instead, the author described it as a responsibility tied to a promise made long before my birth. I recognized the final sentence, written in the same style as the note from the windmill. The same initial signed the page. I sat back on the wooden floor, holding the papers carefully. My father must have found these all been given, them and understood their importance. Perhaps he intended to tell me when the time was right, or perhaps circumstances prevented him. Either way, I knew now that the woods concealed something more than just old trees and quiet trails. I closed the metal box, placed everything back into the hidden compartment, and covered it exactly as I had found it. Whatever these documents pointed to, I needed to approach it carefully. I stepped outside the shed and let the morning light wash over me. The sky was cloudless, and the quiet hum of insects blended with the soft rustling of the leaves. Nature carried on with its rhythms, unaware of the truth quietly unfolding beneath it. Before going into the woods, I decided to revisit the farmhouse. I wanted to look through some of my father's belongings, hoping to find a clue that might connect the documents with his past. I walked to his old desk, still neatly arranged, as if he had stepped away only moments before. I opened the drawers slowly, searching through letters, manuals, and personal notes. Most of it was ordinary, but tucked beneath a stack of papers was a small notebook. The notebook contained my father's handwriting, steady and familiar. Many pages described daily life on the farm, repairs he planned, memories of the harvest seasons. But toward the end, the tone shifted. He wrote about someone visiting him many years earlier, someone connected to his service days, though he never wrote a name. He mentioned a responsibility he was entrusted with, something he agreed to protect because it could influence the future of people beyond our family. The details were intentionally vague, but his words carried a weight that I could feel even now. I closed the notebook gently and stared out the window. My father was not a man who exaggerated or acted impulsively. If he believed something needed protection, he dedicated himself fully. Whatever lay hidden in the woods tied into a promise that was larger than anything I had imagined. The sun climbed higher, stretching shadows across the land. I knew what I had to do next. I packed a small bag with essentials and stepped outside, ready to follow the map into the woods. As I walked away from the farmhouse, I felt a shift in the air, a quiet certainty that I was stepping closer to the truth my father guarded so carefully. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time I felt prepared to face it. The woods behind the farm had always felt familiar to me, but stepping into them that morning felt entirely different. I carried the hand-drawn map from the hidden box, its creases soft from age, its markings guiding me toward a place my father had clearly considered significant. The trees were dense, their branches interwoven like a canopy that filtered the sunlight into narrow beams. The air was cool, carrying a faint scent of moss and earth, and each step I took felt like I was crossing a threshold into a part of my family's history I had never known existed. I walked slowly at first, following the faint path that wound deeper into the forest. Birds called from somewhere above, and small twigs cracked under my boots. My heart beat steadily, more from anticipation than fear. I tried to imagine my father walking this same path years earlier, perhaps carrying the same map, perhaps making the same quiet calculations about what needed to be done. The idea that he had trusted this land, this forest, to hold a secret that could outlast him filled me with both pride and heaviness. The map indicated a specific bend in the trail, marked with an X. When I reached it, I stopped and looked around. The trees here grew closer together, their roots thick and twisted across the soil like the veins of the earth. There was no obvious clearing or landmark. Still, something about the air felt different, as if the silence itself had deepened. I stepped off the path and walked several meters to the left, guided by instinct as much as the map. That was when I saw it, a stone marker partially buried beneath leaves and soil. It wasn't natural. Its sides were straight, and faint carvings traced its surface. I knelt and brushed away the debris. The carvings weren't words, at least not in a language I recognized, but simple geometric shapes, circles, and lines intersecting in deliberate patterns. My father must have known of this marker, or whoever trusted him must have shown it to him. I wondered how long it had been there, and who had placed it before us. Behind the stone marker, the ground sloped gently downward, forming a shallow dip in the terrain. I stepped into it and felt a change beneath my feet. The soil was looser, disturbed at some point, though not recently. I crouched down and ran my fingers through it. There was something hidden beneath the surface. I retrieved a small hand trowel from my bag and began to dig carefully, not wanting to damage anything. The earth gave way easily, and soon the metal edge of an object appeared. It was a wooden container, sealed tightly and surprisingly wet. I lifted it from the ground and brushed away the remaining soil. My breath caught when I realized it was engraved with the same geometric pattern found on the stone marker. Whoever had made these symbols intended them to be recognized together. With slow, deliberate movements, I opened the lid. Inside were several items wrapped in cloth. The first was a small leather-bound notebook. Its pages were yellowed but intact. I opened it carefully and saw it was written in a tidy cursive script, one I recognized from family letters. The handwriting belonged to my father. I sat down, leaning against a tree, and began to read it. He wrote about being approached years after his military service by a former comrade who trusted him deeply. This person had been connected to a group tasked with safeguarding information deemed too sensitive for public distribution, but too important to be lost entirely. My father described it as a responsibility of memory, something that required quiet guardianship rather than action. He never described the nature of the information, only the importance of its preservation. In the later pages, he wrote about me. He mentioned his hope that someday I might understand why he kept these things hidden, that I might see myself not only as his daughter, but as someone capable of continuing what he had begun. His words were steady but personal, infused with a sense of pride I hadn't expected to find in this forest. Reading his reflections made the air feel warmer, as if he were sitting beside me, guiding me through each sentence. I placed the notebook aside and reached for the next item in the box. It was a small metal case, lightweight and smooth. Inside, instead of valuables or documents, was a folded sheet of paper with a single line written in a bold, steady hand. The truth endures only when carried. It was unsigned, but I sensed it came from the same person who had entrusted my father with all of this. The last item in the box was a photograph. It showed my father much younger, standing beside a man I didn't recognize. The background looked like a training facility or a base from decades past. Both men were serious but composed. On the back of the photograph, someone had written a date and a single word: promise. I sat there for a long time, absorbing everything. The forest was quiet except for the distant rustling of leaves. My father had protected these items faithfully, not for glory or gain, but because he believed in the weight of responsibility. And now that weight rested with me. I felt no fear, only a growing resolve to honor the legacy he had chosen to pass on. Eventually, I placed everything back into the wooden container, sealing it carefully. I knew I would need to study the items more thoroughly at home, away from the stillness of the woods. As I rose to leave, the sunlight shifted, casting a long shadow across the ground. It felt like a reminder that time continued to move forward, carrying with it every memory, every promise, every unspoken truth. I followed the path back toward the farm, the map tucked safely in my pocket. The deeper I went into the forest, the more I felt the presence of my father, not as a ghost or an echo, but as a steady influence guiding my steps. I was beginning to understand the message he had left behind, and I knew the next chapters of this discovery would lead me even closer to the heart of his secret. Returning from the woods, I felt as though the landscape around me had subtly changed, even though I knew it hadn't. It was my understanding that had shifted. The farm, the paths my father once walked, the quiet house that had always held his present soul of it seemed layered with stories I had only begun to uncover. By the time I reached the back gate, the sun was high enough to warm the air, casting a soft glow across the fields. I paused for a moment and looked toward the old windmill, remembering how the first note had drawn me into this hidden part of my family's legacy. Inside the house, I placed the wooden container gently on the kitchen table. I brewed tea more out of habit than desire and sat down across from the box. For a long moment, I simply looked at it, studying its aged grain and the faint marks along its edges. The geometric symbols carved into the lid seemed more deliberate now, as if they held meaning I just hadn't learned to read yet. Before opening the box again, I retrieved my father's notebook from my bag. I felt a need to read his words with the clarity of daylight rather than the quiet tension of the forest. I turned to the section where he mentioned being approached after his service. This time, I noticed subtle details I had missed earlier. Descriptions of trust, of a shared experience that bound him to his comrade, and of a sense of duty that extended beyond personal obligation. It wasn't simply about guarding something hidden. It was about preserving a memory that had the potential to shape future generations. I set the notebook aside and opened the wooden box again. I lifted the photograph first. The man beside my father looked calm, almost thoughtful. His expression suggested weight, but not fear. I wondered what kind of promise the two of them had made and why that word had been chosen to mark the back of the image. There was a seriousness in their posture that implied this was no ordinary pact. I placed the photograph down and took the small metal case in my hands again. The message inside, "The truth endures only when carried," echoed in my mind more loudly now. I realized it was not meant to instruct, but to remind. My father had carried this truth for decades, believing that its importance transcended time. Whatever it meant, it was now mine to understand. After setting the metal case aside, I slowly unwrapped the cloth around the remaining items. This time I noticed a second layer beneath the first, thinner and wrapped tightly around another object. It was a small, cylindrical container made of polished wood, sealed with a simple twist mechanism. I opened it carefully. Inside was a rolled parchment, brittle but intact. I unrolled it delicately on the table. To my surprise, it contained a list of names. Some were clearly British. Others appeared to be from different nationalities. Some had titles or notes beside them, while others were simply written with no additional context. None of the names, at least at first glance, were familiar to me. The bottom of the parchment held a short sentence. "Those who stood together, though not in uniform." I stared at the words, trying to make sense of them. It was clear the document was related to my father's past, but the phrasing suggested something more complex than formal service records. Perhaps these individuals had been part of a coordinated effort that acted alongside official channels. Or perhaps they represented civilians whose contributions became tied to matters that were never fully recorded. My mind drifted back to my father's description of being entrusted with a responsibility. Was this list part of that responsibility? Was he meant to ensure these names were not forgotten? I gently touched the parchment, imagining the lives behind each line. I spent the next hour examining the items again and again, hoping their meaning would become clearer with repetition. Instead, I found myself returning to one central realization. My father had protected these things not because they were dangerous, but because they were meaningful. They were fragments of a story that had shaped him, and he must have believed that one day they would matter to me as well. After carefully repacking the items, I brought the container into the living room and placed it on the coffee table. I needed space to think. I sat in my father's old chair, the one he used to sit in when reading letters or listening to the radio. For a moment, I closed my eyes and allowed myself to remember him. Not as the figure who had served in a historic conflict, but as the man who had quietly tended this land, who had taught me to appreciate small things, who had always carried more depth than he chose to reveal. When I opened my eyes again, the room felt different, the silence less heavy and more purposeful. That was when I noticed something I had overlooked: the drawer beneath the old radio cabinet. It was usually locked, and for years I assumed it held nothing important. But now, the possibility that it contained something connected to the items in the wooden box seemed too strong to ignore. I retrieved the small set of keys my father had kept in a tin by the window. Only one of them fit the lock. When I turned it, the drawer opened smoothly. Inside was a stack of envelopes bound with twine. Each envelope was addressed to someone different, but none had ever been mailed. They were written in my father's handwriting. I lifted the first envelope and gently slid out the letter inside. It was written to the same man who appeared in the photograph. In it, my father described the farm, his family, and his commitment to honoring the promise they had made. The tone was calm but resolute. He spoke not of secrecy, but of stewardship. I set the letter aside and opened another. This one was addressed to someone whose name appeared on the parchment. Again, it carried no tone of fear or urgency, only respect, gratitude, and remembrance. It became clear that these letters were meant to serve as acknowledgements, perhaps even as closure for individuals connected to a shared chapter that had never been publicly documented. As I sifted through the letters, I found one with my name on it. My breath caught. The envelope was sealed, untouched. I hesitated for a moment before opening it. Inside was a single page written in my father's steady script. He wrote that if I was reading this, it meant I had found what he had protected. He told me he trusted my judgment, that he hoped the responsibility would not burden me, and that he believed understanding these pieces of the past would help shape the future I chose. His final line was simple: "You are stronger than you know." I folded the letter gently, a warmth spreading through me that was half sorrow, half resolved. The truth was becoming clearer, even if the full picture had not yet emerged. My father's legacy was not defined by conflict or secrecy. It was defined by the quiet strength required to remember, to protect, and to carry forward. As evening settled outside, I placed all the letters back in the drawer except for the one addressed to me. That one remained in my hands. I realized that the next steps would require not just understanding the past, but deciding how to honor it, and I was finally ready to begin. The morning after reading my father's letter felt strangely calm, as if the house itself understood the weight of what I had discovered. I woke earlier than usual, the air still cool and quiet. For a moment I stayed in bed, staring at the ceiling and replaying his final words in my mind. He had written them years ago, perhaps unsure whether I would ever read them. Yet they carried a clarity that reached across time, speaking directly to the person I had become at 65, living on the same land he had once tended with unwavering dedication. I got dressed and walked downstairs. The wooden container, the notebook, and the letters remained on the table where I had left them. But they no longer felt like mysterious relics. They felt like a conversation still unfolding, a connection with my father that bridged the life he lived and the life I was trying to understand. I poured myself a cup of tea and sat down beside the items, letting the steam warm my face as the early light filtered in through the kitchen window. My first thought was to revisit the list of names on the parchment. I unrolled it carefully, my eyes tracing each line. The names were simple, unadorned, yet they seemed to carry a quiet gravity. I realized something I hadn't noticed the day before. Several names were grouped together, separated into clusters by faint horizontal marks. Perhaps each group represented a specific moment in time, a shared event, or a particular promise made among them. The thought made me wonder how deeply intertwined these people had been with my father's life. I decided I needed a clearer understanding of who these individuals were, even if the documents offered limited information. My father's notebook provided fragments of context references to cooperation, to trust built under difficult circumstances, to commitments that extended beyond duty. It was becoming evident that these people had played significant roles not as officials or leaders, but as quiet contributors to something larger than themselves. They had preserved knowledge, safeguarded memories, and passed forward truths that were better protected privately than displayed publicly. As I read, I couldn't help but feel humbled by the thought that my father, who had always been modest and unassuming, was part of a network of individuals who valued integrity above recognition. Their contributions were stitched into the spaces between headlines and official records, shaping outcomes in ways that were never heralded. I began to understand why he had guarded these items with such devotion. They represented a story of quiet resilience, one that relied on trust rather than attention. The next step, I realized, was to explore the meanings behind the geometric symbols carved into the wooden box and the stone marker in the forest. I retrieved a notebook of my own and sketched the symbols from memory as best as I could, then added the patterns from the box for comparison. They resembled intersecting lines and circles, not decorative, but purposeful. Perhaps they marked a shared understanding among the individuals on the list, or a method of identifying trustworthy custodians of the documents. I spent nearly an hour comparing the shapes, redrawing them, and examining them from different angles. As I did, a subtle pattern began to emerge. Each symbol consisted of a central point surrounded by interconnected shapes, forming a structure that resembled a web. It reminded me of cooperation of many individuals connected by a shared purpose. I wondered if that was the intention behind the design. If so, it echoed exactly what my father had described, group-bound not by authority, but by mutual trust. I placed the drawings aside and opened the letter my father had written to me again. The words read differently now. They felt less like instructions and more like guidance. His confidence in me was almost unsettling, as if he had seen something in me I had yet to fully recognize. I folded the letter and held it in my hands, letting its message settle in my chest. After finishing my tea, I stepped outside to clear my mind. The farm was quiet except for the gentle rustling of leaves. The fields spread wide, unchanged by the revelations of the past days, yet each familiar detail felt newly meaningful. I walked toward the fence line, following the same route my father used to take during his morning rounds. I remembered how he would stop by the hedgerow simply to appreciate the stillness of dawn, how he believed that observing the land taught patience and gratitude. Standing there now, I imagined him beside me, not as the custodian of secrets, but as the man who believed deeply in the value of reflection. I realized that understanding his legacy required more than reading documents. It required embracing the quiet strength he lived by every day. With a renewed sense of purpose, I returned to the house. I decided to organize everything systematically so I could examine the connections more clearly. I arranged the wooden container, the letters, the notebook, the parchment, and the photograph across the table. For the first time, I laid them out as a single collection rather than separate discoveries. Seeing them together allowed me to notice something that had escaped me before. Each item represented a different facet of the truth my father had sought to preserve. The notebook reflected his experience. The letters carried his voice. The parchment represented the people who shared his commitment. The photograph showed the beginning of the promise, and the wooden box protected it all. I took a deep breath and began reading each letter again, slowly, with careful attention to every detail. Many of them repeated themes of gratitude and remembrance. Others spoke of commitments fulfilled or promises maintained. None mentioned fear or conflict directly. Instead, they emphasized cooperation, trust, and the importance of safeguarding certain knowledge for the right moment. That phrase echoed in my mind. The right moment. Was now that moment? Was I meant to share these stories or simply understand them? I didn't yet know, but I sensed that chapter 10 of this journey, whatever it would bring, would help me answer that question. As the day grew late, I gathered the documents and placed them back in the wooden container, handling each item with reverence. I carried the box to my father's old chair and placed it beside me. I didn't open it again. Instead, I sat quietly, letting the weight of everything settle around me. I understood now that the truth my father carried was not about revealing hidden events or exposing forgotten deeds. It was about honoring the integrity of those who chose to act quietly, with purpose, without expecting recognition. It was about ensuring that their contributions were not lost to time, and now I was the one entrusted to carry that truth forward. I woke before dawn, unable to shake a restlessness that felt different from anything I had carried through the previous days. The farmhouse was completely silent, the kind of deep quiet that makes every creak of wood sound deliberate. I sat at the edge of my bed, staring at the faded pattern on the floorboards, wondering why the sense of urgency inside me had grown so strong overnight. It felt as if the story I thought I was uncovering had suddenly widened, revealing layers I had not yet dared to face. I went downstairs, made a pot of tea, and carried the warm mug to the table, where the notes from my research were spread out. For the first time, I noticed how many details I had overlooked. The fragments of letters, the coded markings hidden in the margins of my grandfather's journal, and the objects I had found underground. They formed a pattern, though I still did not understand its meaning. All I knew was that he had wanted me to find them. That thought alone was enough to make my hands tremble slightly. Around mid-morning, I walked outside, letting the cold air steady me. The fields stretched out in quiet lines, their winter barrenness turning the landscape into a muted canvas. I followed the familiar path to the barn, drawn by a feeling I could not explain. When I pushed open the door, the smell of dust and wood met me, along with the faint echo of memories I had never personally experienced, but somehow felt connected to. My grandfather had spent countless hours here. I imagined him moving between the stalls, humming softly the way he used to when I was a child. I climbed the old ladder to the loft, a place I had avoided for years simply because it reminded me too much of the days when he would tell stories while repairing tools. The boards creaked under me as I stepped inside. Dust floated in the air, illuminated by the thin light coming through the slats. Something felt out of place. I knelt and brushed aside debris until my fingers hit the edge of a wooden plank that moved slightly when pressed. My heart quickened. I pulled it up carefully and saw a small folded cloth, aged and stained with time. Inside it, wrapped with an almost ceremonial neatness, was a thin metal bracelet engraved with a series of numbers and a single initial. I recognized the initial immediately. It matched one of the names mentioned in the letters I had found, a name my grandfather had never spoken aloud. I closed my hand around the bracelet, feeling the weight of the revelation. This wasn't simply an object he had hidden. It was something he had protected, something that mattered deeply to him. I sat in the loft for almost an hour, trying to piece together how this person fit into his past. The stories he had shared with me when I was younger had always been careful, filtered, almost gentle compared to the reality hinted at in his writings. Now, as I examined the bracelet, I sensed there was a truth he had never been able to express. Not because he didn't trust me, but because some experiences refused to be shaped into words. They remain trapped within the people who lived them, emerging only when someone else is willing to listen in a different way. I climbed back down and walked toward the house, the bracelet wrapped safely in my pocket. Inside, I placed it on the table beside the journal. Something about the arrangement felt right, as if I had finally restored small pieces of a story that had been waiting for decades to be acknowledged. I opened the journal again, focusing on a page I hadn't understood at first. There was a faint sketch there, almost invisible, showing the outline of a tower and a date scribbled underneath. I compared it to the markings on the bracelet, and suddenly the connection became clear. There had been someone who stood beside him during the most difficult part of his journey. Someone whose presence he had memorialized through coded notes and objects rather than direct confession. The realization hit me with unexpected force. My grandfather had not just been remembering a moment in history. He had been honoring someone who had shaped him, someone he felt responsible for keeping alive through these small traces. I felt a deep sense of responsibility settling on me. I knew I couldn't let these pieces remain silent anymore. The rest of the afternoon passed in a calm but determined rhythm. I organized the notes, set the objects in order, and began writing everything I understood so far. It was the first time I felt genuinely close to him again, as though the distance created by time and loss had briefly dissolved. The farm outside remained quiet, the air crisp with the cold of the approaching evening. When the sun finally dipped below the horizon, I stood by the window holding the journal to my chest. I whispered a promise into the dim room, a promise that I would continue unraveling the truth he left for me. Not to expose anything harmful or to sensationalize his experiences, but to preserve the memory he had carried with such quiet strength. For the first time, I felt at peace with the path ahead. The story he had begun no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a legacy, one I was ready to honor with the same care he had shown in leaving it behind.